I propose to take questions 1, 2 and 3 together. As deputies are aware, the panel of parties talks on parades, flags and contending with the past under the chairmanship of Richard Hass and the vice-chairmanship of Megan O'Sullivan concluded in the early hours of New Year's Eve. I wish to commend Drs Hass and O'Sullivan for the energy, commitment and vision that they brought to their work. The panel of parties talks arose from an initiative by First Minister Peter Robinson and Deputy First Minister Martin McGuinness last May, when they established a working group of representatives from each of the 5 Northern Ireland executive parties to examine the contentious issues of flags, parades and the past. The establishment of the working group formed part of the executives together building a united community strategy aimed at improving community relations and continuing Northern Ireland's journey towards a more united and reconciled society. Drs Hass and O'Sullivan started work in September 2013 with the objective of concluding agreement by the end of last year. They undertook an ambitious programme of work, including an extensive process of consultation with wider society between September and November, which proved particularly valuable. Following 4 earlier rounds of discussions, the talks then entered an intensive political phase in the run-up to Christmas and between Christmas and the New Year. Drs Hass and O'Sullivan circulated a number of draft texts to the parties, with a 7th and final one submitted to the 5 parties in the early hours of New Year's Eve. I will briefly outline to the House the main provisions of the final Hass-O'Sullivan proposals. On parades, the proposals recognise parading as an important cultural and historical tradition for many in Northern Ireland, which enjoys protection under European and international human rights law. They note the wide variety of other rights potentially affected by parades and other events and call for a new consensus based on rights, responsibilities and relationships. The proposals provide for devolution of responsibility for parades to the Northern Ireland Executive, which would require legislation at Westminster and then in the Northern Ireland Assembly. Such legislation would establish 2 new bodies which would take over responsibilities currently held by the Parades Commission. An Office for Parades, Select Commemorations and Related Protests would have responsibility for receiving event notifications and promoting dialogue and mediation among event organisers and local communities. An Authority for Public Events Adjudication would in some cases set conditions on the relatively small number of events which prove contentious. Determinations will be made by a 7-member panel led by a legally qualified person. Affected parties could pursue an internal review and judicial review. A new code of conduct would be enshrined in legislation by the Northern Ireland Assembly. Discussion on flags and emblems proved the most difficult. There was no agreed approach reached on the flying of flags on official buildings or the unofficial display of flags and emblems in public spaces. It was recognised by the panel of parties that these issues are closely linked to larger debates about sovereignty, identity and related matters, which they judged to be beyond the remit of the talks. The proposals provide for a commission on identity, culture and tradition to hold public discussions on these issues throughout Northern Ireland. The Commission's remit would not be limited to flags and emblems and would include consultations on Irish and other languages, including Ulster Scots, a Bill of Rights, gender, public holidays, possibly including a day of remembrance or reflection, and memorabilia and other items in public buildings. The Commission would comprise of MLAs and non-political members, would report within 18 months. The First Minister and Deputy First Minister would bring any recommendations of the Commission receiving broad support to the Northern Ireland Executive for further action. During the period of the talks, substantial progress was made on agreeing an approach to dealing with the legacy of the past. The final proposals make special provision for victims and survivors, affirming that their individual choices should be paramount wherever possible. The proposals welcome the ongoing review of the Victims and Survivors Service and pledged to promptly consider recommended reforms, including the establishment of a comprehensive mental trauma service. They establish a historical investigations unit with the full investigative powers of the PSNI to take over the troubles-related deaths cases at present within the remit of the Historical Inquiries Team and the Historical Unit of the Police Ombudsman of Northern Ireland. The proposals provide that where the evidence warrants, the HIU could refer cases to the Public Prosecution Service. The HIU would consider remaining HET cases in chronological order. In extreme cases of old age or illness, cases could be brought forward out of sequence. After the HIU has completed reviews of all outstanding HET and PONI cases, it would consider requests for review again, cases previously examined by the HET or PONI. Should resources permit, it would also consider requests for reviews of cases involving serious injury but not death. The proposals call for an independent commission for information retrieval to enable victims and survivors to seek and privately receive information about conflict-related events. The ICIR would not provide amnesty for those who come forward with information about the conflict. It would provide those coming forward with limited immunity, also known as inadmissibility, for statements given to the ICIR. The information provided to the ICIR could not be used in court, but prosecution would still be possible based on evidence obtained through other means. The ICIR would also use information it recovers, as well as public records and interviews it conducts independently, to assess the presence of certain patterns or themes involving paramilitary organisations or governments in conflict-related cases. It would also report on the degree of cooperation with this process by governments and paramilitary organisations. The proposals call for public statements of acknowledgement by those involved in the conflict, encouraging them to take responsibility for what they have done and to express remorse for the pain that they have caused. Under the proposals, the Executive would pledge to facilitate the collection of individual narratives of the conflict and to establish an archive for their preservation. As deputies are aware, the Government, in common with the British Government, was not directly involved in the talks process. The Government has, however, provided ongoing support and encouragement to the political parties throughout the process, working closely with the British Government. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the close engagement of the US administration throughout this process and to place on record our appreciation.
I have to interrupt the rest of the reply will appear in the official report. Maureen, I'll come back to Deputy Sullivan has a question, and I call her now. Then I'll call
it was yes, it's on the same topic, and I suppose it must have been extremely frustrating and disappointing for both Dr. Haas and Professor Sullivan that after all the toing and froing back across the Atlantic, all the various drafts, that it didn't come to fruition, and it didn't see a resolution and an agreement that could be accepted by all sides. We know the flags issue, the parades issue and the legacy issues, and they are very, very serious. But the other aspect of my question is the prisoner issue, which we have discussed before. And I do think that while that's not being resolved, and while the injustice is going on with prisoners in the north, that's going to be an issue that's going to threaten peace. And as you know, there are a group of us from the Dáil who have been visiting prisoners in the north, not just the Republican prisoners, but also loyalist prisoners. So it's very, very obvious that there are issues, and certainly revoking licences, not giving reasons for revoking of licences, leaving people on remand for 3, sometimes 4 years, and then attaching really draconian conditions when there is a release being discussed, that's not contributing either, and I think that has to be addressed also.
Well, first of all, the prisoners issue was not directly involved in this, as Deputy Sullivan acknowledges. As she also knows, I have raised a number of these issues with the Secretary of State and indeed with the Minister for Justice in Northern Ireland. Some of the cases, as you know, are at different stages in court processes and review processes and so on, and obviously we have to be mindful of where they are in the court situation. I think it also has to be said that we have seen in recent months some activity that is very worrying. I think, and I'm sure everybody in this House will roundly condemn any attempts at placing bombs or engaging in any activity of that kind. The attacks, for example, on officers of the PSNI, which has no place in our society and has no basis or no support of any kind. I think that what we have to do is, Dr. Haas and Dr. O'Sullivan made very, very significant progress. This is a very comprehensive document. It covers some issues that have been contentious and difficult for a very long period of time. And I think that what we need to do now is to press forward with that. And as I said, I'm in contact with the Secretary of State. I've spoken since the break over the New Year period with the leaders of all of the political parties in Northern Ireland. I intend to continue that dialogue. We are in continuing contact with the Haas O'Sullivan team, and we are also in contact with the United States administration, who have been very helpful in this whole process.
Very briefly,